Hi, welcome to Group 4's presentation on analyzing the NSPE Code of Ethics. My name is Stephanie, and this presentation was created by Katt, Demechko, Joe Kresic, Jordan Rosales, myself, Ben Stubbs, Jack Torrence, Jingyi, Casey Young, and Louis Xiangli. First, we will be discussing utilitarianism in the context of the NSPE Code of Ethics. Utilitarianism is discussed at great lengths through pioneers such as John Stuart Mill, and it revolves around the idea of the greatest happiness principle, which essentially states that something is the right thing to do when it produces the most good for the most people. It's a common approach used in engineering as a whole because engineers tend to focus on the idea that if a given solution works, then it is a proper choice to make. One of the most important premises of the NSPE code, if not the most important, is found in section 2.1a, which is similar to section 3.2, which states that engineers shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. Looking at this through the eyes of utilitarianism, it would be in favor of this since it keeps in mind the happiness of the majority of people. However, utilitarianism does not consider the immediate interests of the engineer, which could be an issue in some certain situations. For example, if an engineer has a finding that is beneficial in the long term, but in the short term, the consequences are less than ideal. This is one example of how utilitarianism requires the NSPE Code of Ethics to be harsher on engineers. This is due to the fact that engineers have such an impact on the health and safety of others, meaning, for example, that if there's an underqualified engineer working on a bridge project, utilitarianism states that they can be fired since there are potential worse outcomes that could happen, such as injury and death, if the engineer is to make a mistake, and these outcomes are worse than a singular engineer losing their job, according to utilitarianism.
My name is Jordan Rosales, and I will also be exploring the NSPE Code of Ethics through a utilitarian lens. While the objectives for both utilitarianism and the NSPE Code of Ethics may be to maximize good, overall, the very principles in which the NSPE Code of Ethics is rooted are against the end justifies the means view of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory, meaning that the consequences of actions are what justify its morality. In a consequentialist society, a majority of the NSPE Code of Ethics would be ruled as unnecessary and irrelevant, as most of the code focuses on the appropriate motivations of actions and the means in which engineers should operate rather than the outcomes and the consequences of such actions. I will be discussing which parts of the NSPE Code of Ethics align with utilitarianism and would be agreed with by Mill as important rules for the operations of engineers. There are four characteristics of classical utilitarianism, and one of these characteristics is impartiality. This means that each individual's pleasure or displeasure matters as much as any others. Mill describes this characteristic by stating that utilitarianism requires one to be as strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator, which means that everyone in a utilitarian society must be completely impartial, taking the role of a spectator in each of their actions and having an equal compassion for everyone else. Impartiality is also highlighted in the NSPE preamble as a requirement for the operations of engineers, as it states that accordingly, the services provided by engineers require honesty, impartiality, fairness, and equity. And these must be dedicated to the protection of public health, safety, and welfare. Impartiality is also addressed within its own section of the NSPE Code of Ethics when it states in Section 5 that the engineers should not be influenced in their professional duties by conflicting interests.
Okay, so my name is Katt, and I also have a slide on utilitarianism and the NSPE. So I'm going to start by talking about act and rule utilitarianism. So this is Mill and Brandt's approach to ethics. Rule utilitarianism actually stems from act utilitarianism and is much more common in engineering. Rule utilitarianism, as kind of seen by the name, is based on a set of rules, and making these decisions is based on a set of rules that are followed, and if it's broken, then it is immoral. This plays along with engineering because the NSPE is a set of rules for engineers. And so in one way or another, rule utilitarianism is actually used a lot in engineering. I'm also going to discuss two parts of the NSPE that I think stuck out the most with utilitarianism. The first point is engineers shall avoid deceptive acts. So the NSPE actually urges engineers to make decisions based on the good for everybody and not make selfish decisions. The second point I will point out about the NSPE is that engineers shall not be influenced in their professional duties by conflicting interests. So this also goes along with the deceptive acts portion of the NSPE, but it requires that engineers don't allow their own personal interests and opinions to get in the way of the whole. This basically plays with utilitarianism because the NSPE strives to have everybody influenced in a positive way and make sure that everything is running smoothly and not as an individual. So if you're making a decision that is selfish or based on your own opinions, but it doesn't promote the good of everyone in the situation or the good of the project or anything related to engineering, then it is immoral. So that is my take on the utilitarianism portion of the NSPE.
Now I'm going to be evaluating the rules of practice in the NSP Code of Ethics through the lens of Kantianism. Kant would agree with much of this section as it repeatedly focuses on the ethics of honesty and human safety. Starting with section 1, which states engineers shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. Part A of this section says that if an engineer's judgment is overruled under circumstances that endanger life or property, they shall notify their employer or client and such other authority as may be appropriate. Kant would agree with this sentiment, as his second formulation states that one should act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in any other person, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. By this he means that humans should inherently be treated with some sense of dignity. Next, in section 1, part D, it says that engineers shall not permit the use of their name or associate in business ventures with any person or firm that they believe is engaged in fraudulent or dishonest enterprise. Kant would agree with this statement heavily. He is famously against lying in all its forms. In fact, Kant has said that, but a lie is a lie and itself intrinsically evil, whether it is told with good or bad intents. Thus, he would think it is ethical to not associate with people or firms that are dishonest. Next, in section 3, it states engineers shall issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner. Kant would agree with this sentiment, especially part A, which states that engineers shall be objective and truthful in professional reports, statements, or testimony, again on the basis that lying is evil. Part C of this section says that engineers shall issue no statements, criticisms, or arguments on technical matters that are inspired or paid for by interested parties. Kant would agree with this section too, because engineers putting statements paid for by interested parties without some form of transparency is a form of dishonesty. Lastly, I'm going to be talking about section 5, which says that engineers shall avoid deceptive acts. Specifically, part A, which says that engineers shall not falsify their qualifications or permit misrepresentation of their or their associates' qualifications. They shall not misrepresent or exaggerate their responsibilities in or for the subject matter of prior assignments. Brochures or other presentations incident to the solicitation of employment shall not misrepresent pertinent facts concerning employers, employees, associates, joint ventures, or past accomplishments. So in this section, it uses many words such as falsify, misrepresent, or exaggerate that Kant would believe is lying, and as I've stated before, Kant is against lying.
I'm Casey Young, and I will be discussing Kantianism, which have to do with the professional obligations in the Code of Ethics. For section 2 in the professional obligations, it says engineers shall at all times strive to serve the public interest. According to Kant, this falls under the principle of duty for the duty theories, where you respect the autonomy and rationality of persons. So that's basically a rationale is all knowledge comes from a certain reason. So basically, you're trying to do the right thing regardless of the outcome. Kant says that you completely ignore the consequences. So when you're trying to serve the public's best interest, whatever comes across the board and as right initially, you will do that as opposed to, or regardless of what, the end product is. If it initially seems the right thing to do, that's what you're going to do. Another one, section 4 says engineers shall not disclose without consent confidential information concerning the business affairs or technical process of any present or former client employees. This is where it gets kind of dicey with that. Katt says, as said in the previous slide, where he's big on not lying. So technically, according to Katt, if somebody asked you about confidential information, about your job, about a client, you are obligated to tell them, because regardless of what the consequences would be, or what the outcome would be. Then the last one, engineers shall not attempt to attain employment or advancement or professional engagements by untruthfully criticizing other engineers. This goes back to, once again, the big thing about him lying. So you can't talk bad about other people or other projects to help your advancement, because that would go against his big thing about anti-lying.
I'm going to talk about how under a Kantian lens, one might view sections 1, 3, and 5 of the professional obligations. I'm going to start with talking about section 3 to lay the groundwork, talking about the rest of the sections. One of the main ideas to grasp about Kantianism is the idea of a maxim. A maxim is the principle on which you act a certain way. This slide will be focusing on the formula of the end itself. So the formula of the end itself states that you should act in a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. Essentially, Kant would say that however you act, the intention or the maxim behind it when dealing with others, it must treat others as not merely just means, but also as ends themselves. When two parties are exchanging something, like a service, then Kant argues that in order for the exchange to be moral, each party must consent to the exchange, recognizing that the other party has their own motivations and purposes themselves. They are not to be just used as a prompt to accomplish their own ends. In other words, both parties must consent to each other's maxims for the exchange. However, when one party deceives the other, they don't accurately tell the other party their own maxim for the exchange. This means that the party being deceived couldn't possibly consent to the exchange that is taking place. They may consent to what they think is the maxim for the other party, but in reality, they don't even know the true maxim since they have been deceived. When this happens, then the party being deceived is being used as merely a mean, a prop for the scheme of the deceiver. This violates Kant's formula of the end itself and is therefore immoral and unjust. Section 3 states that engineers shall avoid all conduct and practice that deceives the public. So if engineers are offering the public a service, which is an exchange, if they are deceptive in any way towards the public about their practices, then the public couldn't possibly consent in full to the exchange taking place, since they don't know the entire maxim of engineers. If engineers deceive the public, for example, by inaccurately misrepresenting a fact in a public report, as given by example under point A, then even though the public is not an individual, the individuals that make up the public are still being used by the engineers as merely a mean. So Kant would wholeheartedly agree with this section of the NSP Code of Ethics. Section 5 states that engineers shall not be influenced in their professional duties by conflicting interests. Kant defines justice as acting on no maxims that uses others as mere means. However, Kant also makes the distinction that even if the criteria of justice is met, that doesn't mean others are being treated as ends upon themselves to the fullest. Beneficence meets the criteria of justice, also goes beyond that by also acting on maxims that promote and support others' ends. So even if by being influenced by conflicting professional interests, the engineer isn't just using one of the interests as mere means, because they are catering to conflicting interests, the engineer can't possibly be beneficial towards both interests. The engineer can't support either of the interests as ends upon themselves to the fullest, since the maxims of each interest are conflicting. So Kant would encourage for Section 5 to be followed to promote beneficence. Section 1 states that engineers shall be guided in all their religions by the highest standards of honesty and integrity. So under Section 1, Part A, it states that engineers shall acknowledge their errors and shall not distort or alter the facts. And Part D states that engineers shall not attempt to attract an engineer or another employer by false or misleading pretenses. Kant would argue and agree for these points because by doing so, engineers would not be deceiving clients or employees or employers, which would be going along with the formula of the end itself, as discussed before. Section 1B states that engineers shall advise their clients or employers when they believe a project will not be successful. Kant would also encourage our engineers to follow this part, since by doing so, this promotes fulfilling treaty clients as ends themselves to the fullest, because they're trying to benefit them most by advising them.
So next we are going to talk about virtue ethics. So what is virtue ethics? Well, it was created by Aristotle in 384 to around 322 BCE, and it focuses on the right character rather than the right action. So this is a bit different from Kantianism and utilitarianism that only focus on action, whereas in virtue ethics, we focus on character. So the emphasis is not on which action is the right action, but what sort of action the person with the right character perform. So we kind of look at the question of what sort of character traits make someone a good person. Aristotle even stated that the good life for humans is achieved when we act in accordance with reason. So it's virtue ethics is a mix of character traits and reason. And it very much follows the term eudaimonia, which is the active exercise of the mind in conformity with perfect goodness or virtue. Another word for eudaimonia is also called flourishing, and that's the overall goal for people, is to actively practice eudaimonia and to actively exercise our minds so that we have these virtuous traits. And Aristotle also said that you can use moral education to develop these character traits. It does take time and effort and practice, as not everyone is born with the perfect character traits, but they can definitely be developed. So again, the overall idea of virtue ethics is that we are evaluating character, not actions.
Hi, my name is Ben Stubbs. I will be recording for Lewis Lee as he is sick and unable to record his own video right now. We had virtue ethics, and we'll be talking about sections 1 and 6 that Louis completed. Now it's time to evaluate the professional obligations under the perspective of virtue ethics. Let's begin with section 1. Engineers shall be guided in all their relations by the highest standards of honesty and integrity. In fact, literally, the philosophy of virtue is a very simple philosophy. There is a paragraph in Aristotle's theory of virtues that virtues are determined by correct reasons. Virtue requires the right desire and right reason. Acting for the wrong reason is acting viciously. On the other hand, an agent can try to start for the right reasons but fail because he or she has wrong wishes. A virtuous person does things effortlessly, is aware of the right reason, and has the right desire for harmony, and has an internal state of virtue that can be smoothly put into action. A virtuous person can be an example set an example of virtue for others. Therefore, the first requirement for an engineer is to not do evil. In the work of an engineer, he must always demand high standards. For section 6, engineers shall not attempt to attain any employment or advancement or professional engagements by untruthfully criticizing other engineers or in other improper or unquestionable methods. I think that on this point, a celebrity of Eastern virtue and ethics, Confucius, would definitely agree with this point of view. One of his words is, prefer yourself to others and treat others with kindness. He prefers that if a person cannot accept their point of view of this matter, then he or she should not impose this matter on others. Obviously, as an engineer, a person is very reluctant to be slandered or criticized, and engineers have no reason to do this, and therefore, engineers have no reason to do this to other engineers.
So kind of staying in the realm of virtue ethics, we will talk about section 3 and section 7 of the NSPE Code of Ethics. So section 3 states that engineers shall avoid all conduct or practice that deceives the public. So let's say, for example, I'm part of a company that's going to build a bridge. I also obviously have budgetary restraints. So I decide to cut costs where I can. And one of these costs is in the material of one of the parts of the bridge. So cutting the costs is going to obviously save me money, but it's going to make the bridge maybe a little less sturdy, maybe not as strong. It can cause risk of failure when people are on the road. Obviously, after completion of the building of the bridge, people are going to drive on the road on the bridge and expect there to be no risk of collapsing, of any failure. But with the company I'm a part of, we were deceitful in our practice because we didn't tell the public that we cut that cost and that there is actually an increased risk of a tragedy to happen on the bridge. So that right there is just a quick example of what we're trying to avoid in the engineering world and in really all professions exactly. So in the virtue ethics standpoint, yes, definitely is in line with it. And like we talked about in class with virtues and vices, the virtue at hand here is honesty, the vice being deceit. So yeah, definitely virtue ethics supports section 3. If we're all honest, with our team members, the public, we're gonna avoid these types of errors and mistakes. So moving into section 7, engineers shall not attempt to injure maliciously or falsely, directly or indirectly, the professional reputation, prospects, practice, or employment of other engineers. So this one kind of has more to do with the soft side of things. It's not technical engineering work, but it's the reputation of a person. So say, for example, you're on a team with someone and you don't like working with them, you just don't like them in general. You can go to your boss or manager and talk to them about this or that, to make the whole company and the whole team better. But don't go to your manager, boss, and spread lies, exaggerate what the person did, with the attempt of trying to get them fired or something like that, get them in trouble. Because really, that's just you're going after someone forcefully and trying to mess up their job or their career, which is obviously not a good thing. So definitely section 7 is also in line with virtue ethics. From a virtue ethics standpoint, it definitely likes what section 7 is saying to avoid these kinds of issues that could arise.
My name is Ben Stubbs, and I will be presenting Virtue Ethics Professional Obligations sections 2 and 5. In section 2, it states that engineers shall at all times strive to serve public interest. Virtue ethics is about being the best person you can be, letting your moral character be your decision-making process. It is about being able to make the right decision, not because it is the best decision, but because it is what a person of many virtues would make. To be an engineer is always important to be using your skill set to help those around you. Not everyone has the trained skill set and is in place to make decisions that could impact whole communities like you would be. That's why it's important to have a good character that can help lead you to the right decisions for public interest. Excuse me. In section 5, it states that engineers should not be influenced in their professional duties by conflicting interests. Aristotle praised being virtuous and having the right reason for decisions be made. An example of what not to do would be letting conflicting interests help guide decision-making process. A virtuous person would make decisions because it is the best and right decision and it agrees with their character and moral guides or moral ethics, and not because it may lead to a more desirable outcome for themselves. Thank you.
And then these are our works cited and sources used. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation.